Tonight, of course, is Webinar Wednesday, so welcome. The topic is what to know about diet and MS. And of course, this series is brought to you by Can Do MS. I'd also like to thank our generous sponsors for supporting this year's webinar series. Thank you. Additionally, our theme for the evening, or for the month of September, is actually going to be healthy nutrition. So we're kicking that off tonight with the webinar. And then tomorrow we have our Jumpstart program where we'll talk about nutritious, delicious, and doable cooking for MS. We'll have a couple of dietitians as well as some occupational therapists on that program to show us some tips and tricks when it comes to diet, nutrition, and cooking. We also have a YQA this month. Your questions answered about nutrition. We have a Black community meetup and our Exercise MS Moves meetup. So please join us for one of those programs. We'd love to see you again this month. Also, I want to give a shout out to anyone who might be joining us from the Washington area this evening. At the end of this month, we have an in-person program on September 30th, where you can join Can Do MS in person in Seattle. And 5 in-person attendees will have the chance to be gifted a one-on-one coaching session. So a little bit more incentive to attend, but we would love to see you at that program. Okay, so let's get down to business. I'd like to point out a few Zoom features that you can utilize tonight during the webinar. So please use the Q&A feature for questions you have. We'll save about 20 minutes at the end of this webinar for Q&A. If you would like to, you can also use the chat box to chat amongst each other, share comments, etc. during the program. If you do feel distracted by the Q&A panel or the chat box, please feel free to close those features down and ignore them so you can focus on tonight's rich content. Lastly, I'm going to drop a link in the chat box right now for everyone. The presentation is being recorded tonight and will be archived on the Can Do MS website, but I've also dropped a copy of the presentation slides here in the chat box for you so you can access those, and we'll also have those accessible on our website tomorrow. And without further ado, I do want to introduce our speaker tonight. So welcome, Dr. Alana Katz-Sands. For joining us. Alana is a neurologist from New York. She works at an MS center at Mount Sinai. Alana has a clinical practice where she cares for people with MS, and she's also heavily involved in research related to MS and diet and nutrition and MS. We're excited to have you here tonight, Alana. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wealth of knowledge about healthy nutrition. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here tonight. And thank you so much to Krista for running the slides for us tonight. Okay, so we'll get started. So our learning objectives for tonight are, first of all, to understand what we know about diet and MS. So I'll spend some time kind of going through what evidence we do have. We'll start out with some kind of hypothetical basic science background stuff, and then we'll talk about different dietary components and patterns and what evidence we do and don't have for people with MS. And then we'll talk a bit about some of the more practical things. So we'll talk a bit about how MS symptoms might impact people's eating habits. The part about how what we eat can impact MS symptoms is actually woven throughout the presentation as we go through all of the research evidence. And we'll end on some practical tips and strategies. Okay, so first of all, why are we interested in diet? And the first part of this is something that everyone here knows very well. It's because people who are living with MS are asking. So as clinicians, that means this has to be something that we're really interested in, right? And I think this stems from, and the group can think about this, I think this really stems from a desire for people who are living with MS to really be proactive, right? It's different to have something that you can do for yourself as opposed to something that a doctor gives you or tells you to do. And I think this is, the idea that this is a natural approach to complement traditional disease-modifying therapies is really very appealing to people. Next one, Krista. I believe strongly that any guidance, as a clinician, any guidance that we give to people who are living with MS should be based on evidence. It shouldn't just be, well, everyone should eat healthy. We should really be working as a research community toward building evidence that'll help us provide proper guidance for people. And then last one on here, from again, from the provider standpoint, my job, I think part of my job is to be able to advocate for resources for my patients to help with access and implementation. And I think the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we move the field forward from a research perspective, because once we have evidence, then we can actually go to insurers and say, hey, you should be covering dietitian visits for everyone with MS, and you should cover this many visits, and this is what it takes, and these kinds of things. From a scientific standpoint, we know that there's a strong environmental component to MS. That's something we've known for a long time, right? Genetics does not explain nearly all of it, and there's a lot of variability in outcomes, right? So we know that if I see two patients who are the same age and kind of look roughly the same in terms of their, how MS has impacted them on this day, and I start them on the same medication, and we fast forward 10 years, they could look very different from each other, right? One of those people may have really no physical signs of MS after 10 years, and the other one might really be severely impacted. And we don't really have a good understanding for why that is. And that means that it's our job as researchers to be looking for modifiable factors that can impact people's prognosis. So how can we best set people up to be as successful and healthy as possible? There's also increasing scientific evidence, some of which I'll present to you tonight, that diet can help manage MS symptoms and also act as a disease modifier. And we're finally making progress, I would say, in the research in the last few years. There's been some mechanistic studies, some preclinical studies looking at animal model research, some observational studies that I'll tell you about, and some early clinical trials. Next one, Krista. So in terms of thinking about how diet can have an impact, right? So how can something that you eat and put into your mouth and swallow, how can that actually have effects? And I think there's kind of two main categories that we think about. One is the indirect effects that are mediated by comorbidities that we know are associated with worse outcomes. So we know that people who live with MS have a prognosis that's not as good if they also have issues such as obesity or an adverse cholesterol profile, diabetes, high blood pressure. We know that those things are associated with worse outcomes in terms of MRI and level of physical and cognitive disability over time. And of course, those things are at least indirectly related to diet. But that's not what we're going to focus on tonight. Tonight, we're actually going to focus on the effects that are really directly related to diet. And so thinking about, well, what might be the direct effects of some of the metabolites in the diet? What effects could be mediated through the gut microbiota, the bacteria that live in the gut? And there's multiple ways that can happen. We're not going to focus a lot on the basic science stuff tonight, but I just kind of wanted to bring that up so people can think like, how can we connect some of those dots? Okay, and so the way I'd like people to think about foods, and I always tell this to my colleagues, is we think about our pharmaceuticals as these molecular structures, and we know what they look like from a molecular standpoint. We know what receptors they bind to and what their actions are. And we really should be thinking about foods in much the same way. Because really, at the end of the day, they're also chemical structures, right? They have different molecular components, varying structures, and similarly, they can bind to different receptors in the body. They can bind to, immune cells, they can bind to cells in the intestine, and they have all different kinds of effects. And so this brings us to this complicated slide that I'm not going to go into, but again, I just wanted to kind of give an overview of the idea that there are these communication pathways between the gut and the brain that diet can use. And so you can see here some of the things that can happen when we ingest different foods. So we'll see here something people may have heard about is you see SCFAs there, short chain fatty acids, and the way that those can affect different immune cells in the body that can really have distant effects, really even outside the intestine, right? So we know that a lot of the immune system lives inside the gut. And so there are some direct communications that occur right there inside the gut. And then there's signaling that happens once those foods are processed and metabolized by the bacteria that live there, the gut microbiota. They can have wide effects into the bloodstream. They can affect distant immune cells. And we know that some of these metabolites can even diffuse across that blood-brain barrier, getting into the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so I think that that'll be it for our basic science part for tonight, but happy to answer further questions about that. And we've done other content and stuff on gut microbiota if people are interested in that stuff. But let's get into some of the pieces of diet. So first, let's look through some of the dietary components. And the way that I've selected the ones I'm going to talk about tonight are based on, I think, the questions I get most often from my patients in my practice. But there certainly are other things that we think about too. Okay, so dairy is one of the things I get asked about most commonly. And it's one of the ones that we have kind of the least evidence about. So why does dairy come up? Well, there have been a couple of basic science studies, such as this one, and there was actually another recently. I'll have to add that into my slide deck that was recently published, kind of doing a similar design. But here, looking at T cell reactivity, T cells being some of our immune cells, oh, okay. I see in here someone asking me about getting the slides and someone suggesting taking a picture with your phone, which is always great, but the slides actually are posted. There's a link. I think Krista already put it in the chat, and then this presentation will be archived and the slide, everything will be posted on the website. So don't feel like you have to capture everything. You can sit and just listen. And yep, there's the Krista posted again. There's the link for the slides. Okay. So there's a couple of different mechanisms by which we think dairy might be, quote, inflammatory. There's been this study that showed that people who have MS have heightened responses to different antigens in milk. As to the question about lactate, probably yes, if all of this is true. And of course, we don't have the clinical studies to really support, knowing whether this results in a problem or not. We can observe these because these are basic science studies. We can observe them, but unless we actually do a trial where we really test this out, I would consider this kind of just interesting pieces of scientific literature, but hard to kind of give advice based on this. But yes, lactate would be included if we believe that this stuff is true, because lactate is just actually regular milk where the lactose, one of the sugars in milk, has already been digested. And that's for people who are lactose intolerant. But it's otherwise the same as regular milk. And so here, one of the issues, one of the questions has been, is one of the proteins in milk a problem for people with MS? And the idea is that the milk protein butyrophilin maybe looks kind of similar to the immune system to myelin. And so that's one of the hypotheses about why this might be bad for people who have MS, because perhaps this is milk is stirring up the immune system in an adverse way. Some people also think that inflammation can be mediated through the intestinal microbiome. There have been some studies in people with inflammatory bowel disease that have showed kind of a proliferation of certain bacteria that seem to be promoting inflammation that are increased by ingesting dairy products. So when we've tried to look at this clinically, there hasn't been a whole lot of work on this, but the registry studies have been kind of mixed, meaning that when people have done studies of surveys where they ask people like, how much milk do you drink? And then they look at rates of MS and things, it's been kind of mixed, with some studies suggesting that, yes, exactly, a great new study out of Germany. Yes, exactly, but it was a mouse study. Yep, exactly. And so there haven't really been any like clinical studies in humans where like we try to give people milk and then we see, what happens to them from a clinical standpoint to see if they have worse MS outcomes or things like that. And so it's hard to kind of give advice based on this, but I wanted to present it nonetheless, since this is something people like to ask about. Okay. So another component that people will often ask about is, and I think we should think about is thinking about fats. And this kind of comes up a lot in terms of thinking about animal products and meats and also cheeses and things like that for dairy, in terms of thinking about the saturated fats and then sources of these other fats. So just to remind people, from chemistry classes when we were growing up, saturated fats are where the fatty acid chain is, saturated, so full of hydrogens and no double bonds. Polyunsaturated is where the fatty acid chain has multiple double bonds, and then monounsaturated is where there's one double bond. So in terms of studies that we've had, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Dr. Swank, who really was a pioneer for dietary research. I mean, he was interested in this topic many, many years before everybody else, was interested and before it was a popular thing to study. And he really did some really interesting work. Unfortunately, the work was done kind of before the modern research era. And so there are certain biases and things that were introduced into the study that make it really hard to interpret the results. But I will tell you about the study because it's out there and it's interesting. So Swank based his studies on, he started doing this interventional study because he observed that there were these epidemiologic studies observing that people from like the coastal regions seemed to have less MS than people from the internal regions where people were relying more on like dairy products like meats and cheeses versus people relying more on like fish and plants. And so he developed this interventional study where he assigned people and he said, okay, everyone in the study, you should all eat a low-fat diet and particularly a low-saturated fat diet. And then what he did was over time, he followed people over many, many years. And then he divided people into what he called good dieters or poor dieters, meaning did they follow the diet or not, basically. And then he saw what happened to them. And the people who were labeled good dieters did better. And, they had less mortality. They were more likely to be alive at follow-up. They were less likely to be really disabled from their MS. The issue here is that, of course, now in the modern era, we would randomly assign people to either follow or not follow a certain diet. And here, people selected themselves, right? Because he told everyone to follow the diet. And so there's a lot of biases there because we know that healthy habits hang together. So people who were in the good dieters column were probably also less likely to smoke. They were more likely to exercise, right? All of those things kind of go together. There may be other reasons that we don't know about. And so the design of the study makes it kind of hard to interpret, but nonetheless, I think it's interesting. Other studies looking at fats, an observational study, a prospective pediatric study, where children with MS were followed for about 2 years. And what the investigators noted was that for every 10% increase in their overall energy intake, their caloric intake from saturated fat, the risk of having a relapse was increased more than 3 times. So again, it's an observational study, but I think very interesting. Next slide, please. So thinking about polyunsaturated fats, these are found in fish and walnuts and flax seeds. In animal models, so in basic science studies, these have been shown to have important effects on modulating the immune system and protecting the nervous system. When we've looked at epidemiologic studies that look at kind of overall, population level, again, kind of mixed results on these in terms of which ones seem to be more important. So I think still thinking about this stuff, but it does seem that these fats are important and helpful. The clinical trials have really not looked at dietary intake. They've more looked at supplements, and they've been very small and not really able to gather much from them. Fruits and vegetables, I think we can all agree that these are good for you, but just thinking through how they might be of benefit in MS, one way is potentially related to the fiber intake. So we know that eating foods that are high in fiber will make your gut produce more short chain fatty acids, which was one of the components that we looked at earlier. We also know that the flavonoids, the brightly colored Elements of fruits, pigments in fruits and vegetables have important effects on the immune system and also on neuroprotection and repair. And I just provided one example here with a figure from one of the papers from the literature showing that, for example, tryptophan that is derived from the diet, from cruciferous vegetables, can, after it's metabolized by the gut microbiota, can actually cross the blood-brain barrier and have really important effects inside the brain. And no, that slide was not saying fish was not necessarily good for MS. It was just saying that among polyunsaturated fats, it was not entirely clear which type is providing the observed protection. It does seem that those types of fats are protective, but some people seem to think it's more the marine-based. Some people seem to think it's more the plant stuff that's protective, and so it's not entirely clear. Going back to the same pediatric cohort that looked at the saturated fats, a 1 cup equivalent increase in vegetable intake decreased the risk of relapse by 50%. So I just want everyone to let that sink in for a minute. This is not a clinical trial, it's an observational study, but that number is kind of as good actually as our clinical trials of disease modifying therapies. So it's interesting. And then there's been a registry study that found a link between higher intake of fruits and vegetables and patient-reported disability and disease activity. Grains and gluten, I would say maybe the top thing that I get asked about, or maybe second to dairy. And I would say the most poorly studied of everything. There's been a little bit of basic science work, but most of the stuff that you hear out there is really, it's hearsay. It's there's been very little work on this topic. The results are very mixed. The only clinical studies that have been done are really not high quality in terms of ability to really learn something from it. A lot of people ask whether gluten is inflammatory. I think it's very hard to know from the work that's been done so far. NARCOMS, which some people here may actually even be part of, an observational cohort of about 7,000 people who are living with MS. In their survey, they found, and this was published by my colleague, Dr. Fitzgerald, they found an association between higher intake of whole grains and a lower level of MS-related disability. So that would go against the theory that grains are inherently bad for people with MS, right? Maybe that's because of the high fiber content in whole grains. And so it's definitely not something, I definitely don't advise my patients to necessarily avoid grains. I do recommend whole grains, and I recommend trying to avoid the more, really refined stuff and added sugars and things like that. But grains are not necessarily bad for you in and of themselves. Salt is something that's been kind of in the news in the past few years in the MS community. We know that from a basic science standpoint, high salt intake makes the immune cells be more pro-inflammatory, and that's been demonstrated in a few different studies. This one study that I have shown here from our Argentinian colleagues, they took 70 people who were living with MS and they stratified them according to their sodium intake, and they found that people who had higher intake of salt had a higher relapse rate and more T2 lesions over about a 2-year period. But then on the other hand, there have been a couple of other studies that really haven't confirmed that effect. And one study also done by my colleague, Dr. Fitzgerald in Hopkins, used old clinical trial data, which had collected urine samples from people. And you can use urine samples to estimate how much salt people intake. And they found no relationship between people's salt intake and their clinical relapses or their level of MRI lesions. And so, again, I think without a clinical trial specifically looking at this, it's kind of hard to know. Okay, so let's move forward. We'll spend a few minutes now talking about some of the different dietary patterns. So there are a lot of different MS diets to choose. And things that people will ask me, next one, Krista, we have some things in here on the bottom, are, these are kind of different. And so is one of them right? And, I then say, well, what's the evidence? What evidence do we have? So we'll spend a few minutes now just kind of going through the evidence that we do have on some of these different patterns. So in terms of overall dietary quality, and this is something that we can assess by using, there are different indices out there that we can use to measure dietary quality. And I'll just tell you very briefly here that in observational studies, higher dietary quality is indeed associated with a lower likelihood of having a high disability level and associated with better physical and mental health related quality of life in a few different studies. That's kind of the take home here. So some patterns that we're looking at, and there certainly are others. We mentioned briefly the swank diet. I'll tell you now a little bit, very briefly about each of these patterns. We'll focus in at the end a little more on the Mediterranean pattern, since that's what our group's been studying, so I can tell you more about that one. Let's move forward with these. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with a modified Paleolithic, also known as a wall. People may be more familiar with the idea of a Wall's protocol diet. And I'll just very briefly, again, I'm going to run through each of these fairly quickly so that we have time for the stuff at the end. Terry Walls and her colleagues recently did a study called the WAVES trial, and they looked at a swank diet and compared it to how people did with a Paleolithic elimination or Wall's diet. We already talked a bit about the swank diet. A Paleolithic elimination diet includes meat, certain fish, certain vegetables, fruits, and then eliminates gluten, casein, lectins. There were 87 participants who had to have fatigue to get into the trial, since that was the primary thing that they were looking at. And they were randomly assigned to follow one of these diets, and followed for 24 weeks. And they found that the Wall's diet, swank diet did also, but the Wall's diet, perhaps more so on some of these endpoints, clearly reduced fatigue in study participants. The McDougall diet has been studied by my colleague, Dr. Yadav at OHSU. The McDougall diet is based on starchy plant-based foods and some non-starchy vegetables and fruits. The idea, casein is a milk protein. The idea is that it's extremely low fat. So only 10% of energy intake can come from fats, and there are no animal products and no oils, including no olive oil. And Dr. Yadav led a study where they randomly assigned 61 people with MS to either follow or not follow this McDougall protocol over a year. They were looking, their primary endpoint was to look at new lesions on MRI, and they didn't find any difference there, or no difference in the clinical relapse rate. There was a significant reduction in fatigue, which was moderated by weight loss. I wouldn't be too disappointed that it seems like this, diet didn't work because this was a very small study, and honestly, it was they set the bar very, very high. I think you would need a much larger and longer study to really be able to see the impact here. And they have a study that they have recently been working on, and I'm sure we're going to be publishing soon, looking at fatigue. Caloric restriction, intermittent fasting, these are very hot topics. I'm sure everyone's familiar. This has gotten not only in the MS literature, this is everywhere in medicine and just in general pop culture now. These patterns have been shown to be of benefit in animal models of MS. And an initial study done from my colleagues again at Hopkins showed that, it is a very small study, but showed that these patterns were relatively well tolerated. They did result in some weight loss and some improved emotional well-being. Dr. Picchio has also been working on intermittent fasting and caloric restriction, and actually recently presented some of her work at one of our recent conferences. And we'll have to update that for next time. The ketogenic diet is, again, very, very popular right now. The idea here is to shift metabolism so that our bodies use fatty acids as the primary energy source. And that results in production of ketone bodies. In animal models and basic science models, there's clearly a benefit to this pattern and the production of ketone bodies. There's been only just a very small open label studies of ketogenic diet in people with MS showing that people could tolerate it. It is a very hard diet to follow. It did seem to be associated with weight loss and improved body composition and improved fatigue, levels of depression and levels of disability in these preliminary studies. But there's a lot more work to do on this topic. And again, it's hard to follow. And I think the other downside is some dietitians don't feel like it's a healthy long-term pattern to follow in terms of heart health and things like that. So now I'll tell you a little bit about why our group has chosen to focus our efforts on the Mediterranean style diets. So unlike some of the other patterns, the general health benefits of this pattern are already very well established. We have some data already in cognitive aging, and we think that this pattern combines the limited available information that I presented to you about the different components that we think might be important. We also feel that this pattern is reasonable in terms of thinking through, like, long-term, are people going to be able to follow this pattern? This is really more of a lifestyle change than a quote diet, which we think is something that's really helpful. It's a very budget-friendly pattern. It doesn't require that people purchase any special products. And it's easy and involves the whole household, which I think is key. We'll talk about that more when we get into the practical tips and tricks. So I'll present to you just very quickly, a few pieces of research that we've done. So we ran a small pilot study of 36 women with MS. A lot of people said to us when we started that we would never be able to recruit the study and that people wouldn't follow it. And people actually did great. We were very pleased. We were able to recruit 36 participants just at our own center who met the criteria and who were willing to randomly be assigned to follow or not follow this intervention for 6 months. People lost about a pound a month, even though we didn't counsel them on weight loss. And we saw significant benefits in the group that got the intervention compared to the non-intervention group with respect to things like fatigue, impact of MS symptoms in daily life, and disability scores. So we were excited about this. This kind of also, we've also been thinking not only about, overall the idea of Mediterranean patterns, which can be, people can think about that differently in different areas of Mediterranean, but specifically the MIND diet, which is Mediterranean-Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. It was developed at a Rush University. Really the idea was to develop a diet that would focus in on things that were thought to be potentially good for brain health and limit things that were thought to probably be not so good for brain health. And so you can see the items here and the scoring, but the idea is that things like vegetables, berries, nuts, olive oil, you get points for that, and you don't get points for things like butter, cheese, red meat and processed products, fast foods, pastries and sweets. And so you end up with a score out of 15. And that's something that we can actually do an observation too, and I'll tell you a bit about that. So we hypothesized that maybe there's a potential benefit to the neurodegenerative part of MS in addition to benefits for the immune system. So the first thing we decided to do was to try to do some observational work. And so I'll present to you a few pieces of research that we've put out now. This first one I'll go by very quickly. This was in our cohort of our reserve against disability in early MS of 185 people who were within the first few years of their diagnosis. And what we found in these research participants is that people who had a high MIND diet score, meaning that they scored very well on those items like berries and greens and things like that, were much less likely to have a lower thalamic volume. The thalamus is a deep structure in the brain, and it's actually one of the first things to start to shrink in people with MS. And so this is among people who are in their 30s and newly diagnosed. And we thought it was very interesting that we were able to see this relationship in people who were so early in their disease course. Next, I'll show you some of the clinical studies that we've done. Again, these are all observational. This one and the next one I'll show you very quickly are from our clinic population. So we're very lucky to have a comprehensive assessment program that we recommend all of our patients go through every year. And the idea is to really get a close look at how people are doing in addition to our clinical visits and our MRIs. And so we do a lot of detailed testing with people, and we collect a lot of information from them. And here what we did was we looked at different factors that we thought could predict. People may be familiar with the MSFC. The MSFC is the multiple sclerosis functional composite, and it is made up of of a few different assessments. One is the timed 25-foot walk, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. Another is the 9-hole peg test, where you put pegs into a dish and we time that. And then the third one is the symbol digit modalities test, where you have to match up symbols and numbers and do that as quickly as you can. And so this is a composite score. And you can see here by this line that there is a clear relationship between people's Mediterranean diet score and their level of MS-related disability as measured by MSFC. And what you can see in this box here on the left, sorry that I know this is probably hard to look at, but these are all abbreviated for all of the different covariates that we could think of. So we took all of the things we could think of that might explain that relationship. So people's age, their sex, their race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, body mass index, MVPA is moderate to vigorous physical activity, so exercise level, sleep, hypertension, diabetes, high cholesterol, smoking. And after we controlled for all of those factors, this is the relationship. It was still there, and it was pretty strong. So this what we thought was pretty interesting and exciting. We similarly did analyses of the other pieces of information that we collect from people there. And so this is just a table that looks at things like the multiple sclerosis impact scale, the fatigue severity scale, the MS walking scale, the perceived deficits questionnaire, and then hospital anxiety and depression scale. And we found actually relationships between the Mediterranean diet score and all of these different patient-reported outcomes. And so again, this was pretty interesting to us. Lastly, this is work that we haven't published yet, but we presented it at the American Academy of Neurology meeting a few months ago, and so I'll share it with you here now. We're hoping to publish it soon. This is a similar analysis, but it was specifically looking at cognition. And again, we found a very clear relationship between people's Mediterranean diet score and their cognitive performance on MS testing. I know we only have a few minutes left. So where does this leave us? Well, I think, there's a couple things that we know. I'm very fortunate to be part of a wonderful group of colleagues who are also really interested in studying diet and who are responsible for all of the studies that I presented to you tonight. And so it's a great group of people. And even though we're kind of studying different patterns and we have different ideas, there are a few things that we decided we all agree on, and these are recommendations that we think are reasonable to make for people now. And there are actually a lot of similarities between some of these patterns. And so this is what we came up with, and these are posted on the National MS Society's website. And these are: prepare meals at home as much as possible, incorporate colorful, fresh fruits and vegetables daily. If you do choose to eat grains, and some people may choose not to eat grains, you should choose whole grains over refined grains. And you want to avoid and limit processed foods and added sugars as much as possible. And so these are kind of the overall recommendations that we all felt comfortable making for people with MS now, in the absence of really specific evidence about what we think people should do. So how to get started? I am very, very fortunate to co-direct our MS Center's Patient Wellness Program for the last 3 years. I co-direct it with our nurse practitioner, Gretchen Mathewson, and we have an absolutely wonderful team, our other nurse practitioner, Stacey Liras, and our dietitian, Jess Gelman, and our physical therapist, Liz Pike, Kate Lasquadro, and our social workers. Conul actually does most of that in our group. It's really a wonderful group of people, and I've learned a lot doing this the last few years. And so we've kind of come up with some things that I think are helpful. And of course, I also counsel people in my practice, and so I've learned a bit about what works and what doesn't work. And so I wanted to share with you kind of some of the tips that we have for people. So the first thing is that I think it's really important to make changes that are going to become your lifestyle, as opposed to looking for like a diet. Diet is like something that the prior generations did. It was like something that they got and was in the freezer, and they heated it up in the microwave and they did the diet, or they had a shake every day for a while. Or the problem with all of those things is that they're not sustainable and they're probably not helpful for us in the long run. And so the idea, I think, is to kind of try to move yourself toward changes that are going to be your lifestyle. And this is just the way that you approach food rather than looking for a specific diet. And I can tell you this is how we've done things in our own house, my own household at home. Um, and I think this is really what works for the long term. You want to think about your goals. Think about what are your goals in the short term? What are some things that you want to kind of change right now? What are some things that you want to change, but you think are going to be longer term for you? You definitely have to consider how your symptoms are going to impact your ability to implement your ideas and to reach your goals. We're going to talk in some of the following slides about fatigue and meal planning and energy conservation techniques, adaptive cooking tools. And I'm really excited to hear from Krista that there's going to be a webinar that's going to have OTs and dietitians. And I'm sure they're going to talk to you all about this stuff too. I think it's really important to include your household in your plans. I think from my experience in talking to people where the person living with MS has a different diet than everyone else in the house, and it means that you have to make 2 different meals all the time, it's really, really hard to sustain that. And so this is, again, part of why I like the Mediterranean pattern so much, is that it's something that everyone in the house can do. In our house, I can tell you I have 4 children. Everyone eats the same food every day. This is the food that we have. This is what it is. It's healthy for everybody. You have this, you have that, whatever it is, everyone eats it. Good for everybody. And so sometimes people will tell me, well, I have, goldfish in my house because I have kids, and then I eat it at 9 o'clock at night. And I tell them goldfish are not good for your children either. You really need to just get rid of those, right? So I think it's really important to just think about your whole household. You're much more likely to be successful if everyone's doing the same thing. Next one. Okay, I think it's important to keep in mind, again, this is something I take a lot of my counseling and things that I learned from working with my kids too, right? So practice makes progress, not practice makes perfect, but practice makes progress. So you want to strive for progress, not perfection. You shouldn't be hard on yourself for, saying like, well, I didn't get it exactly right or whatever. The idea is to make progress. I think it's also great to ask for help. So if you have a primary care doctor, that's a great place to start. If you feel comfortable arranging a visit directly with a dietitian, that's wonderful. I think dietitians are such underutilized resources. They know so much, and they really can be so helpful in all this stuff. You can ask your primary care doctor if they have a dietitian they like to work with. You can ask at your MS center if there's a staff member who can counsel you about diet. A lot of MS centers, even if the physicians don't feel comfortable or educated or have time slots to counsel people about nutrition, there may be someone else in the team who does, even if it's not a dietitian. Perhaps one of the nurses, knows a lot about nutrition. So it's definitely an option, especially if you're not able to visit with a dietitian. And lastly, I think the important thing is to be kind to yourself. So again, it doesn't need to be perfect. And, we're all just doing our best every day, and that's all you can really ask of yourself. So in terms of some tips for conserving energy, and again, I'm sure people are going to go over this again, and I'm sure more detail in the work with the OTs and the dietitians, but planning, I cannot emphasize enough how important planning is. It's really, really hard for anybody, but especially if you live with MS, to come home from a long day of work and feel fatigued, or from taking care of your family, or from whatever you need to do all day, and to then have to prepare meals. And it's really hard to then prepare meals for the next day and everything else you need to do, right? So the more that you plan things in advance, the better off you're going to be. And so I really recommend setting out meal plans at a time interval that works for you. So in thinking about it in terms of what groceries you're going to need, and what the time interval is going to be in terms of when you're going to prepare things. So a lot of people will say, I'm going to plan out 1 week at a time, and that works for them. But your time interval may be different depending on what your house looks like. You want to plan to do the bulk of your preparing at times when you have more energy. And it's going to be different for different people. Some people feel they do better in the morning. Some people feel they do better later in the day. And it also may be different for you on different days, depending on what other activities you need to do in that day. So think about that as well. You may want to consider dividing up the tasks that are required to prepare the meal so you don't have to do it all at once, so it seems less overwhelming. You want to include plans for everything you're going to eat, including snacks. And that's really important because you don't want to be out somewhere and find yourself hungry and in a place where, getting something healthy isn't easy to do or it's not affordable and you end up, buying something that you feel not good about eating later. I highly recommend considering a grocery delivery service so that you don't have to use up your time and energy that you have to prepare your meals in shopping, because that's something that someone else can do for you. I definitely also recommend using recipes that prioritize efficiency. So look for things that are kind of one pot recipes or sheet pan dinners, and then you don't have to spend a lot of time cleaning up. So that's a huge thing, right? Something that you can just take a sheet pan and put a piece of parchment paper down, put a couple pieces of fish on it and some vegetables around it, and there you have a whole meal, and then you don't have to clean anything up. Just stick it in the oven, and when it's out, you toss the parchment paper. It's environmentally very reasonable, and it's easy to do. So I would definitely look for things like that. Preparing enough to have leftovers is a great strategy. Especially if you're someone who's a creature of habit and doesn't mind eating things a couple times in a row. But it's great. It's a great strategy in terms of lunch for tomorrow, and preparing more of something that you're already preparing is definitely less work than preparing something totally separate. Use your freezer, stock your pantry. So another thing you can do with leftovers is to freeze them. And then when you have a day when you really don't have the energy to prepare something, there you go. You have a healthy meal there that you can eat instead of ordering takeout. Something that I've learned from my dietitian friends are that frozen vegetables are often as high quality or even higher quality than fresh, because they are, they are frozen at their peak. And so those are things you can keep in your freezer. Again, if you feel like you can't run to the store that day, great. You have some, frozen broccoli in the freezer that you can use as your vegetable. So cans of beans, nut butters, whole grain pastas, those are things that are shelf stable that you can make into a meal pretty easily. And lastly, I would say you should really take your family and your friends up on offers to help. So when people ask you, how can I help you? A great thing to tell someone is like, well, if you're cooking for your family and you make some extra for mine that I can keep in my freezer, that's wonderful. So when people offer to help you, this is something that I think very tangible that you can ask for help on. I mentioned before that I'm very lucky to be the co-director of a wonderful patient wellness program that focuses on nutrition, exercise, and emotional health. And I really hope, we're working toward, research on this so that hopefully in the future, this is something that everyone who lives with MS can have access to. I think we're really helping people. So it's great to be part of it. Okay. So our key takeaways here, I think we've established that there's a strong scientific rationale for our interest in the role of diet in MS. The evidence that we have is pretty limited right now for particular factors and patterns on MS outcomes, but general principles of healthy eating are very reasonable to recommend now, and I highly recommend that everyone ask for help to get started. With that, I will thank all of the wonderful people that I work with at Mount Sinai and beyond, all of my patients who are so kind in participating in my research. And I always finish with a shout out to my little helpers at home who have actually been startlingly quiet during this presentation. So we'll have to thank them later. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alana. That was some awesome information. I loved the in-depth dive that we got on a lot of it. So thank you. I do want to point out before we dive into a few Q&A options tonight, I do want to point out that at the very end of this webinar, a survey will pop up, and we would really appreciate it if you would take a moment to complete that survey. That helps us to continue to improve our program. So thank you so much for taking that at the end of this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you know what some of the questions are that we had come through tonight. So one, I wanted to start, Google is a slippery slope. So what is the best way to sift through and sort through all the diet advice that we see online, all the different MS diets that are out there? What's the best way to approach this overwhelming amount of knowledge?
Sorry, got a tickle from talking so much. So I would say kind of the same thing applies to diet in terms of what I tell my patients in terms of everything, which is don't Google. Stick with websites that belong to reputable organizations. You can look at the Can Do MS website and look at presentations that are there. The National MS Society has a website that's a wealth of information. They have navigators there that you can talk to help you put things together. You can ask your healthcare provider. You can meet with a dietitian. I think those are all really reputable ways to get information. Anyone can post anything on the internet, and I think it's really hard to vet the stuff that's out there.
Agreed, definitely. So finding a dietitian or a nutrition coach, do most neurologists have someone that they refer in their pocket that they would send people to, or is there another way you would also recommend looking for one of those professionals?
So you can definitely ask your neurologist. You can ask your primary care provider. I think the primary care provider is more likely to have someone.
Okay.
You can also check with your insurance in terms of participating providers.
Okay, great. And then I know that, you and I have talked about this before. Last year we did a podcast about vitamin D and other supplements, other vitamins. So we did have a question come through about vitamins and supplements and if you have a recommendation around using those.
I don't really. I think, the supplement industry is totally unregulated. And so it's very, very hard to assure even what's in the bottle of something you're getting, let alone, think about the fact that these things haven't really been properly studied in people with MS. Definitely a weakness in terms of the research community and things that we need to work on going forward. But as of now, I don't recommend any particular supplements. I think the only thing I'll recommend to my patients is people who are deficient in vitamin D. I'll recommend a vitamin D supplement, but otherwise, we really don't recommend supplements. I tell people, if you have any gaps in your diet, for example, if you're a vegan, then we would recommend that you take the B12, or you may need some iron. But otherwise, if you have a healthy diet, you really are not going to need much in terms of vitamins.
So back to intermittent fasting. Is that safe for people with MS to pursue?
It's a good question. We think it's safe based on the initial studies that have looked at this. We haven't seen any harmful effects of it, but we really don't know. No one has really looked at this any longer than a couple of weeks. A little hard to say. It does seem to have benefits from a basic science standpoint in terms of like inflammation and protecting the nervous system. And we do know that there are beneficial effects in aging and, providing neuroprotection there. But I think hard to know in the MS population because it just hasn't been studied that well yet.
Okay. And then this is an interesting question. I hadn't thought of this before, but is there different nutritional advice for someone with relapsing remitting MS versus a progressive form of MS?
That's a really good question. No, there definitely isn't right now, and we definitely haven't broken people up that way. I can tell you in the observational studies we did in our clinic, because we do have a high number of people, we actually did break people out that way. We did find a stronger impact of the Mediterranean diet score in people with progressive MS, meaning that relationship that we saw there was like a much steeper curve in people with progressive MS, which suggests that maybe it's a neuroprotective, it's a mechanism. But what we've learned about MS is that, we have these categories and they're helpful to some degree, but there's a lot of overlap actually, in terms of what's happening on the inside. And so there's inflammation at all stages of MS. There's neurodegeneration at all stages of MS. And so I'm guessing that what we're going to learn is going to apply to everybody. But yeah.
It's an interesting thought, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, so one other question that I saw come through, if you were on a medication, is there implications for diet and nutritional if you're taking a specific medication, whether that be an MS medication or a steroid or anything like that?
Um, we don't think so in terms of MS medications. A steroid, yes. If I mean, most of people who live with MS are not chronically on steroids because we use other medications, and so they may get like a burst of steroid here or there, but it's not an illness where we usually will use like a daily steroid. Those people who are on daily steroids definitely need to be really careful about their diet because steroids can cause all kinds of disturbances in blood sugar and blood pressure and all these things. You have to be really careful. But most of the MS medicines, no, it shouldn't really matter in terms of which medication you're taking. And yeah.
Awesome. That's great to know. Thank you. So I do want to answer a couple of other questions in the chat via our program tomorrow. So I've seen some questions come through about, struggles with getting your family on board with a certain diet, or, the big inflation that we've seen with some grocery store costs,
Yeah.
etc. How to grocery shop more efficiently. So I've seen a lot of great questions come through. Meal delivery subscriptions. We're actually going to talk about all of that tomorrow. So we have a
Great.
resource on meal planning. We have a resource on some of those delivery subscriptions, and also online shopping as well. So online grocery
Great.
shopping.
Wonderful.
So please definitely join us tomorrow. We're going to talk about all these things. We're going to talk about some scenarios and how to get your family on board too. Some strategies and ideas from dietitians, OTs, and even a psychologist. So we would definitely love to see you on that program. I'm going to drop the link one more time for the Jumpstart program tomorrow as well. And then let me share my screen again really quickly here. So even though the webinar is over, we hope that you stay connected with us. Here's a variety of ways in which you can do so. Next month, we're going to be talking all about sleep. So we're going to have multiple programs about sleep next month with some sleep specialists. So please join us then. That'll be, looks like October 4th. Once again, I'd love to thank our sponsors for their support of this program. And without further ado, that will be it for tonight's program. I want to thank Alana so much for joining us and taking a moment away from your family to be here and share your knowledge with us. And I also want to thank all of our participants for being here. We definitely appreciate you showing up and spending some time for yourself to think about diet and nutrition and what you can do moving forward. So thank you to everyone, and I hope you all have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
And don't forget to take that survey. It's about to pop up right now. Here we go.